Sarah, biological evolution seems to be a problem for religion, not only in the development of human beings different than the traditional creation, but in the problem of evil with so much enormity of suffering of animals prior to human existence and the killings and required by evolution, and also in the apparent need of a soul that religion would have, that there doesn't seem to be a place in evolution where that comes in. So there are a lot of problems that evolution seems to present to religion. How do you deal with evolution?
Well, there's been a great tendency in the last few decades for good liberal theologians who don't want to get into a fundamentalist debate between evolution and God to fall back into the separate magisteria view, which has something very right about it. The thing that's right about it is that when we're talking about God, we're not talking about another very big item that has to be kind of squeezed into the picture at the same level of reality. Because God, if God exists, is that without which there would be nothing at all, and therefore is in a completely ontological, different level, if you like, than the rest of created beings. So the separate magisteria view is correct to that extent. But I think it's made a mistake that's really very important in another way. It has, as it were, deserted the fray. It doesn't want to get into any kind of hard, profoundly, existentially worrying debate about how different pictures of evolutionary development can seriously cohere with the belief in a providential, loving God. It would rather just keep these arenas in two separate boxes.
Because it worries that it may not cohere.
Exactly. Now, we can't, I think, return to an old-fashioned natural theology. But I think there are ways that we can edge forward here if we attend to the most exciting developments that are themselves happening at the moment in evolutionary theory. And this is where I think the most interesting points of potential convergence and discussion lie before us in the next few years. You're probably aware that the mathematicalization of evolutionary theory with the use of game theory and other such techniques is changing the landscape away from the presumption that all that we see in evolution is selfishness regnant over unselfishness. I think when we look back on the latter part of the 20th century, and we're already doing this, we'll see that that extraordinary emphasis on selfishness was itself not mandated by Darwin, and also, historically speaking, actually, has been correlated with a period in the affluent West of kind of boom and bust, the effects of which we now see all too obviously before us. So I would put that in a kind of sociology of knowledge category. What's happening now with the most interesting developments in evolutionary dynamics is the realization that unless there is also unselfishness within the evolutionary spectrum, in particular subgroups or populations, then, although it is rational for any individual entity in a species at any given time to what's called defect, that is, behave selfishly to get the best out of other people, if everybody, to personalize it, but not falsely anthropomorphize it, but if every entity in a species behaves selfishly, then that species will decline. Unless there is a countervailing feature of what's called cooperative behavior, then there is no possibility for creative new developments in evolution, and there will ultimately be a loss of liveliness in a species as a result of overindulgence in selfishness within the species. Now, if we begin to look into what this means for the whole spectrum of evolution, it becomes really fascinating from a philosophical and theological perspective.
Why does that help you theologically?
Right. Well, there are various steps that have to be filled in here. I don't think we should jump over quickly to the theological. That's the mistake made by many debates between theology and science, as if they could go head on. We need the philosophers of science, as it were, as interim conversation partners. Because once you begin to probe what's happening in the sort of broader ontological picture of evolutionary development, especially with the aid of this mathematicalization of understanding the relationship between cooperation and defection in species development, you see that big philosophical questions are being raised. Big philosophical questions about even teleology, which has been really out the window for many generations. That is, what are the conditions under which higher forms of life can emerge from lower forms? Why is it that it now seems that a kind of stable condition of cooperation is needed, of unselfishness is needed for new creative developments to occur? Once you start to debate that philosophically, you see that you've got a range of possible, as it were, meta philosophical explanations that are available to you. And it seems to me that at that point, theology becomes one possible meta-philosophical explanation.
Because if you have a teleology, that would give perhaps a consistency with God having something to do with the evolutionary process.
Exactly.
Whether intervening or having set the process ago with the ends in mind.
But it's interesting that you still are representing those as the two alternatives, setting it up and intervening, because that already, I think, is flavored with an old deist view of God, in which God is a sort of bit player in the universe, starts it up, gets it going, has a tea break, occasionally comes in and fiddles around with it.
The alternative being?
The alternative being that God is ontologically undergirding the entire procedure. Mm-hmm. And that takes a lot of spiritual work to really get your mind round that idea. My perspective is that almost all the God evolution debates, especially in America, don't have a grasp of what it is to think in that way about God. So they think that God is competing on a flat plane, as it were, with other items in the universe. But once you've got over that hurdle, then you can start to think, what would be the most coherent way, metaphysically, to give an account of how it is that evolution develops in these extraordinarily rich ways out of patternings of the relationship between cooperation and defection? What are we learning from these new mathematicalizations that might suggest that we actually have a metaphysical picture here that could make us reconsider whether the God hypothesis would be a coherent one?